All right, welcome everybody to this breakout session. This is The Price of Panic, How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. The authors are Douglas Axe, William Briggs, Jay Richards. We actually interviewed on The Morning Answer this week William Briggs. We have his two co-authors here, Jay Richards and Douglas Axe, and I just want to get their particulars right. Jay Richards, over there. He is a research assistant professor in the Bush School of Business at Catholic University of America, senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, and also co-author of The Privileged Planet, How Our Place in the Cosmos is Designed for Discovery, and the author of Money, Greed, and God. And to my immediate left is Douglas Axe, who is the Maxwell Professor of Molecular Biology at Biola University, the founding director of the Biologic Institute, and the founding editor of Biocomplexity. His work and ideas have been featured in a number of scholarly journals, including the Journal of Molecular Biology. I know you're all subscribers. And the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Nature. So welcome, Mr. Axe and Mr. and Mr. Richards, excuse me. And I'm sure this book is available, The Price of Panic, so please do pick up their book as well, support their work. So let's begin with where we are in Illinois and also in the West. And so I connect, the socialist enclaves, Illinois, Britain, France, which is a second round of lockdowns. In fact, it was reported this morning that the UK locking down for the next month, despite the R rate decreasing, but the death totals are increasing. And what Illinois, Britain, France, Germany have or have not learned as signaled by their second round of lockdowns? Start with the scientist.
Yeah, we could just keep it to the science if we want. No. Well, it's surprising to me. We used to my wife and I lived in Great Britain for 14 years, and the British economy took a huge hit from the first lockdown, and I thought there was a point where Boris Johnson said we're not going to do this again because he reviewed the damage and said it probably wasn't worth the effort. The comparison to make is between Sweden and Great Britain and some of the other countries, because Sweden, of course, took a different route. They opted for leaving the schools open, and they were striving for herd immunity, and Great Britain was doing the same thing until they pulled the plug on March 23rd, I think it was, and decided we're not going to do this, we're going to go the other way. And now when these other countries are having a second round, Sweden is looking pretty good. And a lot of people are saying, actually, Sweden probably didn't do everything right, because we think they didn't do everything they could to protect the vulnerable. But in terms of allowing the kids to go to school and allowing life to continue much as normal, we think that was a great move. And we think it's proving to be a great move.
And just on the Sweden point, the data out this week was the 7-day rolling average for fatalities in France and the UK was about 200. The 7-day rolling average in Sweden was 0.6. Pretty big difference.
Huge.
Jay, to talk as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, when we were working on this book, we started writing this in late March, I think, right? And so our friends mostly thought we were crazy. They said, don't talk about this. Please don't tweet about it. You guys are totally confused about this. But for whatever reason, the three of us were skeptical for various reasons. Not generally skeptical about pandemics. Obviously, you can have pandemics and bugs that kill people. But in this case, we thought, okay, this isn't actually what it seems to be, or certainly what this kind of media panic is. We feel slightly vindicated by the fact that the Great Barrington Declaration scientists have come out, even the World Health Organization, even the CDC numbers. We can just easily cite the CDC numbers now. But we thought the nice thing about having different states with different responses is that we actually have a data set by which we can compare, do the lockdowns make a difference or not? We know the dates of the lockdowns, we know what the different states did, and so you're not stuck with just comparing two examples, which is what the media likes to do, right? We can compare all of them and figure out, okay, is there a pattern? Because you would expect to see a signal in the noise. You'd expect to see a pattern following the government lockdowns if they actually made a difference. And so we do that in the book. And bad news is that there's no obvious discernible pattern at all. What we had hoped is that, okay, well, there's a lot of pain involved in this, but there's at least some benefit to the lockdowns. What we, alas, seem to discover is that it's the lockdowns, the government-imposed lockdowns were almost all pain and no gain. So it's basically all cost and no benefit. So it's truly insane that we are now talking about doing this again. And it's absolutely not based on the data. It's based on this kind of social contagion that unfortunately at least half the population is still in the midst of.
Well, Jay, you're also a philosopher, and I know that's not something you
No.
brag about,
Yeah,
nor
right.
should you. But I mean, just run the logic of this, and we see this playing out in Chicago and Illinois. So transmission from a lot of the research suggests has mostly occurred in households, within households.
Right.
So we want to lock people in households, and then with respect to restaurants and bars, which are now locked down in Illinois and as well as in those Western European countries I mentioned. We think that the spread, the transmission in those places is de minimis, but it actually doesn't matter because all we care about is case counts.
Right.
So we care about case counts. We do care about transmission and where it's occurring, and we want to contact trace it. But then that doesn't matter if the numbers don't come back. So then it's just about aggregate cases, but we're going to lock you down anyway. I mean, I just think people have a hard time following how that makes sense.
You have formalized the argument perfectly.
Yes,
right
thank you.
there.
Yes.
I don't know how to actually improve on that. It's to notice that what we're talking about now is cases, and it started in the summer. Now, a case until July meant someone who was sick enough to go to the hospital or go to the doctor because you have symptoms, and then you get tested, and you get a positive test, and then you become a case, right? So that had a sort of logic to it. We know what that means. Well, what happened is we ramped up the number of tests that we're doing drastically. We're now doing 1 million tests every single day in the United States. Now, there's a positive kind of industrial capacity story to be told there. We're not getting that story. What we're hearing is that, of course, there's these vast spike in cases, which, of course, if you redefine case to mean positive test, and you do 1 million tests a day and the virus is still out there, you're going to have a lot of cases. But what I think more people need to notice is that's what we're actually talking about. We're talking about positive tests. And I want to say, so what? What we want to know is, are people getting hospitalized? Are they in ICU? Are they dying? That's what you actually want to know, and that's not what the media is talking about.
Douglas, Dr. Roger Klein, who is the former head of molecular oncology at the Cleveland Clinic, said this week on our program that herd immunity is being discussed as a strategy. Herd immunity isn't a strategy, it's a biological fact. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, herd immunity is really the way human populations pre-vaccine, there was no option but herd immunity, really. So herd immunity is what happens when a contagious virus or bacterial contagion passes through a community, people get sick, they pass it on, they recover, most of them recover, and you end up with a population that now has antibodies where almost everyone is immune to further infection. It doesn't have to go to 100%. Once you get around 75, 80% of people being immune, it gets harder and harder for something to get spread because most of the people you come into contact with are not susceptible anymore. So you reach a point where the virus or the bacterium is no longer able to be spread the way it was initially, and then the whole population is safe and no one's going to get sick anymore.
And so it's a combination of people getting sick and then also people getting vaccinated when a vaccine comes online. So I just want to make the point that it isn't what so many of the critics say, that if you talk about herd immunity, you're saying we're just going to let the virus run wild. We're not saying that.
No. So the point of a vaccine is to achieve herd immunity faster without people having to get sick. But typically, I mean, I don't know what proportion of the population gets the flu shot every year. I tend to get it, but I think it's under half. So a lot of people are getting immunity to the flu seasonally through getting the flu. So it's still a thing.
I would like both of you to speak to this evolution in the language that accompanies the policies. And the language, of course, is subtle because we have a lot of Orwellian types in public offices, which is, first it was flatten, then it was slow, and now it's stop.
That's right, and that's the key transition to notice, because remember, it was 15 days to flatten the curve, right? Now, the idea was not that you're going to stop it from spreading. It's the same area under both curves, and that was just the presumption, is that, okay, we're not going to literally be able to stop people from actually catching this. We might be able to slow it down temporarily so we don't have excess deaths and sickness from overrunning the hospital. So it had a certain logic to it initially. Well, very quickly, except for some severe pressure points in places like New York and New Jersey, we realized, okay, hospital capacity is not going to be overrun. And then we immediately transitioned into what? To, well, now we're going to try to prevent it. But you told us 2 weeks ago we can't really do that. And so now all of a sudden, we're what? We're staying locked down through the summer somehow to do something. And so far as I can tell, the only rational argument now would be, well, now we're going to hold out for a vaccine, which is actually not rational because we don't know when that, if ever, is going to happen. And we think we can show that the actual cost of the lockdowns themselves will be dramatically greater than the cost of the coronavirus itself. So even if we get a vaccine a year from now, it's completely irrational to lock the country down until that happens because, frankly, to put it bluntly, you're going to kill way more people with the lockdown than the bug itself is going to kill.
No, he said it pretty well. Flatten the curve seems like distant history, though, doesn't it? Because everyone now takes for granted, no, we're trying to stop the spread. You're killing people if you don't wear a mask. It was not that long ago that flatten the curve was what people were saying. And if you looked up what they meant, and it was stated in the press, we're all going to get it anyway. We just want to we want to spread out the cases over time so that the health care is there and it's not overly impacted.
All right, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I'm just exhausted on the topic, but masks. This, to my mind, based on, and I'm a layman, of course, but based on all the studies that I've read, the summations of, and all of the medical experts that we've talked to, there's a variety, though. There's a variety. There's people who say, I agree with you on the lockdowns, but people should wear masks. I know the science is a bit thin on it, but, that's one area where the phrase, out of an abundance of caution, makes sense. And I'm not ideological about it either. I mean, if it was material and it wasn't just a way for everybody to behave like a sentinel of the state, I would be more receptive to it. But because it's being presented as a panacea, I'm less receptive to it. And I just wanted to get particularly your opinion as a scientist about what we know based on the actual research about how what sort of prevention masks provide, number one, and as a corollary to that, what is the deal with that Danish study on mask wearing that nobody will publish?
Here's a little known fact. The World Health Organization 1 year ago, October 2019, published a very carefully done study that was a study of studies. So they went and looked at all the studies on influenza. And so the title is something like Non-Pharmaceutical Interventions for Influenza Pandemics and Epidemics. And they went through all the different things that are thought to perhaps reduce spread of influenza. Now, influenza is not coronavirus, but they're both about the same size. They're both called enveloped viruses. They both have spike proteins. They both infect the same tissues in humans, the upper and lower respiratory tract. So you would think that influenza, which is much more studied than coronavirus, is a good proxy for coronavirus. They're going to be spread in the same ways. This pamphlet says we've looked at study after study on mask wearing, school closure, work closure, social distancing, contact tracing. Not one of these things works. And there's actually pretty solid evidence that they don't work. So quote after quote that you can get from the World Health Organization just 1 year ago saying the evidence for this is extremely weak and inconclusive, or the evidence in the case of mask wearing, there's substantial evidence or significant evidence that it doesn't work to prevent the spread of influenza. Presumably it doesn't work for coronavirus either. And one of the reasons I think this gets a little bit more into the science of why it might not work is that the whole idea of masks and the plexiglass shields that you now see everywhere was behind the basis for that was that particles, that small droplets are the main cause of transmission. So these would be visible particles. When you say it and spray it, you see the droplets, they go maybe 3 or 4 feet. If that's the main mode of transmission, then staying 6 feet away from someone is probably going to keep you from getting from the virus being transmitted. But if aerosols are a major mode of transmission, these are microscopic little particles that are being exhaled when you breathe, when you speak, when you sing, certainly when you cough or you sneeze. And those linger in the air for many minutes or hours. So you could walk through a hallway that someone has walked through 15 minutes ago, and there will still be aerosol particles there. If that is a significant mode of transmission, Anthony Fauci said, yikes, the CDC now recognizes that we made a mistake. We ignored aerosols. This was last month. This was September. We now realize that aerosols are a major mode of transmission. If that's the case, then masks don't work. Nobody claims that masks are protective against aerosols because the aerosol particles are so small and because any gap, nor do the plexiglass shields, because you can have a shield, but the aerosol is just going into the air and lingering in the air. It doesn't make any difference at all. So that would be a scientific reason for why the masks don't work. Another way to look at the science is there any effect in the curves in either the infection or the hospitalization or the death curves based on the time when people were ordered to wear masks? And there just isn't.
Yeah, the data, that was the other part I wanted to get to, too, if you wanted to speak to that more. The data where the researchers like you guys have actually looked at, masks are imposed as mandatory, and the surveying of people saying, people sort of consistently wear masks at a particular rate, and you see no difference between states without a mask mandate or countries without a mask mandate like Sweden versus those with mandates.
Yeah, and there's no relationship. It's a little more complicated only because there was not a consistent policy. We all remember being told, right, initially by the same guys that are telling us we have to do it, that it doesn't make any sense. So that was actually the kind of standard argument, and it doesn't follow. You might say, well, okay, but healthcare workers are wearing it. But this is the difference, is that the word mask refers to so many different things, right? It can refer to a gaiter, which probably makes things worse, actually. These gaiters that we wear to the gym because we have to, it's probably, if anything, it's going to make you sick. Wearing an N95 respirator, right, that is fitted to your face properly and you're constantly changing it out in a health environment is one thing, and at least kind of mechanistically it would make sense, even though it's sort of hard to test this. We're not doing that. We're not walking around, and we're not going to walk around like that. And we're also not going to walk around with hazmat suits on. And so what we're going to wear is gaiters and surgical masks. And look, if aerosol is the way this is transmitted, you have the same lung capacity either way. And so that mask, that surgical mask that we're all wearing, you're just breathing the air around the edge of it. I mean, the other thing is that any air that you're breathing through the mask, if you actually have a viral infected room, do that for an hour, you're filtering that air right through your mask. So you're either breathing it in or it's catching stuff, and then really kind of the dirtiest surface in the room could be the surface of your mask. And every one of us knows perfectly well how badly we do this. And so it's really no surprise that for the general population, there's just so many complicated variables that this idea that there should be this universal mask mandate, as one presidential candidate says, it's utterly absurd. It completely ignores the variation. And the fact that, look, 100 million people begrudgingly wearing masks, this isn't going to work, right? We all know how we're wearing these darn things.
Yeah, there's also a constitutional issue with the national mask mandate, but we'll tackle that another time. I wanted to get to topic areas of trade-offs. Dr. Emily Landon, who is an infectious disease expert at the University of Chicago, she's Governor Pritzker's infectious disease expert of choice. She has said this week at a press conference that gathering with family and friends at Thanksgiving, for example, is a prologue to tragedy. Now, my family has always called our Thanksgiving a prologue to tragedy, but I mean, so the recommendations you're hearing, which is not only lock down by yourself, put yourself in a hyperbaric chamber, no family, no friends, no nothing, particularly with the holidays upon us. How do you react to those recommendations?
Ignore it. I mean, it's absolutely insane. I mean, look, I'm all for sort of complying with reasonable legal protocols, right? And then generally, we want to obey the law of the land. But at some point, the state is doing things that is completely out of its competence and completely out of its jurisdiction. And so the idea that the state, except in an actual emergency, right? So a tsunami or an alien invasion, that's why governors have emergency powers, is in those circumstances, an event happens, and then they have to respond to it. Well, this event, the initial event, wasn't even an event. It was actually governors responded to a prediction of a predictive model of what was going to happen if we didn't do it. They're doing exactly the same thing again. We're hearing about a model that predicts 200,000 dead. It's not an event for which you have to respond in an emergency fashion. It's a prediction about what will happen, and we already have evidence to know that these predictions are not useful. So this idea that the state is going to tell us how we're going to celebrate Thanksgiving inside our house. I think it's utterly absurd, and I hope that states that have this will respond the same way that Los Angelans responded to the no fireworks order on July the 4th.
Which was beautiful to behold, by the way. I'm down in Southern California. It was 3 hours of nonstop fireworks, major fireworks. So here we're kind of like the frog in the proverbial frog in the frying pan, because things that we say, okay, well, this is an exception. We're going to do this for 2 weeks, and then it goes on and on and on. And I think if a couple of years ago someone had told you that governors are going to be telling you how many families you can have to your Thanksgiving table, or Governor Inslee in Washington is telling Washingtonians no more than 2 people to a bedroom, and he wants to assign bedroom monitors to report to the university heads and ultimately report to his office if anyone's violating that. We would have thought that was a joke if we'd heard that a year ago, and now these things are actually happening. So I think a lot of people are stuck on, well, this is about safety mode, and not stepping back to ask, what else is this about? This is about an encroachment on American freedoms that's unlike anything in history, and people are accepting it as though it's a wise thing.
Well, so trade-offs too. Boy, the way, I mean, two people to a bedroom. I mean, the Caligulas on the West Coast. That's going to be really.
They're livid.
Boy, that's really going to put a crimp in their lifestyle. Kids. So I talked to Dr. Lyndon Haviland at CUNY yesterday, or the other day, Thursday actually, and she said something sort of remarkable, talking about the heightened fear and anxiety among kids, young kids in particular, because of the lockdown policies, because of the way we're talking about this. She said that recent studies show the tail on the heightened fear and anxiety for young kids, which is unhealthy, could be as long as 9 years. So in addition to the retardation of their intellectual and academic development, their socialization in schools, with schools being hybrid or shut down, then you have this heightened fear and anxiety that just becomes part of how they deal with the world for an extended period of time. I mean, that strikes me as one of the most underappreciated negative trade-offs for the lockdown policies.
Absolutely. I mean, we were getting numbers right away in March and April of double and triple the number of calls into suicide hotlines, into things like that. You know, the estimates, we'll know after the fact. We think there may be about 75,000 excess deaths of despair in 2020. So suicide, drug, and alcohol overdose. Those are the measurable effects of this kind of anxiety and depression. But both of Doug and I are college professors, and I can tell you that you might think, okay, a 19 or a 20-year-old, no, maybe you don't think this. They're not very well adjusted, actually, if you didn't know that. But they're really, really, really depressed in many cases. And how surprising is this? So Catholic University, which opened, the only university in the District of Columbia that opened at all, but to open for the freshmen only, they had to be in solitary confinement in their dorm rooms for the first 2 weeks, right? And so then they get out and they go somewhere, and then it turns out they're in a room where somebody else tested positive, and then they get locked down again. I mean, this is what we do to prisoners of war against the Geneva Convention, right? We're doing this to kids, and we're doing it to young kids. I mean, the fact that 6 or 7-year-olds, which have about 1,000 times less likely to die from this than people that are over 70. So just really, really low risk, are being trained every day with their bodies. Think of your neighbors, not as neighbors, think of them as potential carriers of deadly disease to kill you, right? Now we're going to do that for months with hygiene theater on our faces. There's just no doubt this is going to have incredible psychological effects. I just worry that it will be long term.
Since you guys are both professors, just to follow up on that, what do you see happening on your respective campuses?
CUA is going to try to open up in the spring, and we're letting seniors come back on campus. But Mayor Bowser's, that's awesome, but we're having to do all sorts of things because of the city government in Washington, D.C. that don't make any sense. I mean, it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. You have a plexiglass, a screen that's not even where you need to stand. Kids are having to wear masks. They're having to stay isolated from each other. I think if you want civil disobedience, we need nonviolent mass non-compliance with these things. That's what is going to finally stop it.
So I'm a professor at Biola University, which is in La Mirada, California, right at the southern edge of Los Angeles County, and you go a few miles from there and you're in Orange County. And very different policies between LA County and Orange County, and regrettably we're stuck in LA County. Thankfully, our president, President Barry Corey, has been kind of on the leading edge of petitioning the state for colleges to get open. This is very unhealthy, and it's financially a disaster for private colleges to have things closed down. We are planning to open in the spring, and so far I think they've found favor with the governing authorities to allow that to happen. So that's the plan.
Well, maybe if you agree to power the university just with windmills in exchange for, you could get some relief from Gavin Newsom. Yeah, it's interesting. I was in Santa Monica and Venice Beach just a few weeks ago. And I mean, those cities are ghost towns, and it's bizarre, actually. I mean, it's sort of the same thing with Chicago, where I live. But I mean, the economic devastation and sort of the not just tolerance of it, it's almost like celebration, almost like a badge of survival that you're destroying these cities with these lockdown policies. I mean, you guys have to see that both the places where you live and teach.
Absolutely. I mean, so D.C., of course, there is variation. Weirdly, where I'm in Maryland is a little better than D.C. And Virginia, which you would think of as more conservative, is actually just really bizarre on this. But I mean, we all know, we remember just by May, we had 41 million new jobless claims. That's a really good sort of proxy for the cost of what was in effect 2.5 months of lockdowns. We estimate in the book that the cost to a lockdown in the United States is about $1 trillion a month. Per month, $1 trillion per month. So we've run up a bill. It's certainly $4 or $5 trillion by this point. And remember, this is, people say, well, who cares about dollars? No, that's jobs and healthcare and school tuition and meals and all these kinds of things, right? And so the government is, of course, borrowing money to infuse it back into our bank accounts, but we're also not producing, right? So we've got more money chasing around fewer goods that are producing. And so there's going to be a serious economic consequence to this. And that's quite apart from excess deaths, 80,000 missed cancer screenings in the 3 months of the lockdown, all these kinds of things. And so just the idea at the beginning that, oh, well, this is about lives versus dollars, it's incredibly naive because dollars are about lives. It's just a proxy for human flourishing. And I honestly, Doug and Matt Briggs and I, we thought, well, when the book comes out in October, this will be a kind of after-action report where we're saying the original title of the book was "What Just Happened," because we thought everybody will be asking that question. You know, we're out of it. We had no idea that it would still be happening. We're still having this debate in October. It's extraordinary, and the data is manifest at this point.
And the lives versus dollars piece of this, too, going back to somebody mentioned the World Health Organization and their opposition to lockdowns, the special envoy at WHO for COVID-19. And one of the things he said, as Dr. Sunetra Gupta has said, as many people have said, as actually the head of the UN World Food Program said back in the spring, is don't lock down. You destroy the supply chains we need from the first world to the developing world for the food that we get from the first world to feed the developing world. We're looking at, he said, 30 million people who could starve to death if these supply chains are disrupted to the point where we don't have other means to get food to people who are in need of food. So for all these rich people in places like Washington, D.C. and Virginia that are so supportive of authoritarianism, who consider themselves global citizens, the amount of devastation we're looking at globally for people just not being able to get food and water from our countries to their countries and communities is massive. And that's not me saying it, it's the UN saying it, it's the WHO saying it.
That's right. There's been a bit of a disagreement between the WHO, which is the public health arm of the UN, and the UN Food Program, which predicted this early. Now, maybe the predictions will be slightly wrong. Maybe it's, they had estimated maybe 300,000 deaths a day. Yeah. Oh, maybe it's just 30,000 deaths every day from starvation because of a disruption to the food supply chain. I mean, this is utterly catastrophic. And it's not the people, I mean, in any time in history, there's always going to be a segment of the population right at the edge, just over the line in terms of absolute poverty. And it's likely that we about a billion people moved out of absolute poverty globally since 1990. Half that many may return back to the prior state just this year because of the lockdowns. And so that's why I don't understand how this became a left-right issue, because this is a matter of the global poor. They're going to suffer. We're part of the digital economy. You know what we did? We locked down and wrote a book during the lockdowns, right? Because we had extra time. I can tell you none of the little family Mexican restaurants were able to do that in my neighborhood.
No, absolutely. And speaking of restaurants, so I spoke, you see how I reference people I talked to on my syndicated shows, like subtle ways to promote my show? That's how skilled I am. So I spoke with John Taffer, the bar rescue guy, John Taffer. It was just awesome. He's a wild man, but I mean, this guy knows his stuff about restaurants and the hospitality industry across the country. He said it was really interesting what he had to say. And he actually interviewed Trump for his podcast this week, and Trump has like a 4-pronged plan to rescue the hospitality industry, regardless of outcome on November 3rd, actually. He wants to move it right after the election. But he talked about how it's uneven. So actually New Jersey restaurants are ahead of where they were this time last year because of what New York and Connecticut have done to shut down restaurants so you have flight to New Jersey. But he said of Chicago, for example, he's pretty optimistic that there could be a V-shaped recovery in the hospitality industry as soon as the spring of next year, for those who can hang on, if what President Trump told him he would do actually comes to pass. But he said, Chicago in particular, he said, you guys have really made a mistake with this secondary lockdown, because that secondary lockdown will have an exponentially negative impact on the survival of restaurants and bars and hotels in Chicago. And your recovery from this will be a longer horizon. And I just think, again, the left versus right, the rich versus poor, you're talking about a lot of people who are workaday people in the hospitality industry, and I mean, they are being wiped out, just wiped out, and that's not going to recover the way that banks and some other sectors have recovered.
There's a big advantage to large corporations because they can weather a storm like this, but small businesses cannot. I don't even know. I mean, Jay did the chapter on the cost. I don't even know if we know how many small businesses have collapsed.
It's in the tens of thousands. We know that. And I'm guessing by now, that was in April, it's probably in the hundreds of thousands. And then, of course, there are companies like Amazon, right, which have done really well, but it's because they were sort of poised for the digital economy. These others, I mean, look, we want to be a country that has lots and lots of small and medium-sized businesses that have the possibility of becoming large businesses. We don't want to prevent that. You don't want to punish companies for being successful. But every company starts small. And so what we're essentially doing is we're cutting off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder, which is basically just guaranteeing a few giant actors, all of whom coincidentally happen to be left-wing woke capitalists, right? And so there is this kind of a culture war element to this that we're seeing with social media censorship. And I'm glad that the President Trump has gotten clear on his messaging in the last couple of weeks, so that at the very least, the American public is going to have a choice in this election, and it's in part a referendum on the lockdowns. Mr. Biden has been quite clear in his enthusiasm for mask and lockdowns, and President Trump has said no more lockdowns. The problem is that as long as states even have the threat of lockdowns, even if they're not locking down, that's absolutely devastating to businesses. Just the mere possibility that you just might not be able to open your business for the next 3 weeks, and you don't know, right? That has almost the same sort of medium-term effects as lockdowns themselves.
Speaking of Biden, at the final debate, he said that he doesn't want to shut down the country. He's going to shut down the virus. So Doug, let's react to that. Can you shut down the virus without shutting down the country, or even if you do shut down the country?
No, and if you go back to February, March, everyone knew you couldn't shut down a virus, even into April. When we were talking about flattening the curve, we were not going to shut down the virus. What we were going to do is try to do everything we could to spread out the cases so that we didn't have a disastrous impact, a huge surge that would fill hospitals and prevent hospitals from treating people. That didn't happen. That surge never happened. And so a lot of people were thinking, okay, here's the end of the 2 weeks. We're going to go back to normal. But no, it's like so many other things. You can raise taxes, but rarely do you see taxes coming down. It's a ratchet. So once you get a certain level of control, it seems very difficult for bureaucrats to let go of that control. Instead, they seize it and ratchet it up. And the press is part of this. They're ratcheting up the fear hype the whole way. And the fear is the way that you get people to comply. If you get people terrified of what might happen, then you get them to do anything. They relinquish their freedoms, and it's very hard to take this back again.
What's your assessment of what's happening to the scientific community generally? It seems to me, and others have remarked upon this, that it has become so politicized that now you worry that people will have a greatly heightened distrust of scientists who talk like politicians rather than just stick in their lane to the science. And we've seen that in terms of you mentioned the Great Barrington Declaration, with respect to some of the treatment by those infectious disease experts like Sunetra Gupta and Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff being attacked personally for disagreeing on what the science tells us the policy should be.
Yeah, this is brought out. It's a secret in the scientific community that scientists have always been very human, and it's always been very political and ugly behind the scenes at times. This has really brought it to the forefront, though. So I think we're seeing the worst of scientists behaving politically. This has always happened, but it's become huge right now. There's a team of two people from Harvey Mudd College and one from Claremont McKenna College in Southern California, who recently published a paper. The title has Castro consensus in it. So they're talking about this idea of consensus, and they say it's a Castro consensus, referring to Fidel Castro in Cuba, when you don't have the freedom to disagree with it. And this is the sort of consensus that people are talking about, scientific consensus, or Biden saying, I follow the science. What you're really doing is picking the scientists who are saying what you want to hear and then forcing everyone else off the platform. And that's a Castro consensus, where you're punishing the people who are speaking against it. And there are scientists who are speaking against all of these supposed scientific consensus positions. This paper says, if people are not free to disagree with the consensus view, then you know you've got an unhealthy version of consensus.
Well, also, just sort of as a first principle, science is based on skepticism. You have to prove what you're saying. You have to submit it to peer review. And the science is never really settled because the new questions are always being asked, right?
Right. It's not even a consensus discipline. So to say most of the scientists agree with this, well, you could back up in the history of science, and most of scientists agree with wrong position after wrong position after wrong position that was eventually overturned when a few, sometimes only one scientist, said that's not right, and eventually the correct idea won the day. So it was never meant to be a consensus or a democratic discipline. It's a discipline where the truth rules, and the best way to get at the truth is to allow all people to be working on it and to put out their work and to have it there for public consumption and free consumption.
One of the mistakes I think President Trump made with respect to his response to this was going with the institutional people that were at NIH and CDC at the outset. So just sticking with Fauci and Birx, and not getting rid of them, but so they're experts, and I recognize their expertise and their experience, so they can have their say too. But bringing in the Martin Kulldorffs, the Scott Atlases, the Jay Bhattacharyas, the Sunetra Guptas, if she wanted to come over from England, earlier on. So you had a broader cadre of scientists that could hash out some of their substantive disagreements, both with the same expertise, looking at the same data, with the same understanding of infectious disease.
That's what we call the tyranny of experts. That's why it's in the subtitle, because there's this weird phenomenon. It's not as if, okay, if you happen to be the director of some agency you've never heard of in the federal government, you're a scientific official for public health, but that's not like winning the gold medal of scientific intelligence. The media treats that as if, okay, here's the smartest guy. No, he just happens to be the guy that's been working for the federal government for 35 years. He's not any smarter than these guys at Stanford Medical School.
Well, it was funny because Kristen Welker, the moderator of the last debate, said Tony Fauci, the best known infectious. He said, yes, he's the best known, but that doesn't mean he's the best.
No, in fact, that's the symptom of the problem. It's the fact that we know who he is, that he was lionized by the media. We think this is one of the reasons this happened. Rather than being a sort of nameless, anonymous advisor with a very narrow specialty, advising the president alongside other advisors, and then the president could sort of weigh the advice against each other. Instead, he was immediately elevated to the sort of infallible muse or expert who speaks for science, because in this case there was no consensus on his advice. What it was is that the Imperial College London had produced a model which was terrible in late March. The Director General of the World Health Organization glommed onto it. Dr. Anthony Fauci glommed onto it. He told President Trump, and so on April the 8th, when reporters asked President Trump, why did you advise lockdowns? He said, well, two very smart people were in my office, and they said 2.2 million people are going to die if we don't lock it down. That number came from that predictive model. It came from nowhere else. It wasn't data. And so we need to fix that situation so that independent scientists have access to political leaders that can shut our country down in the future.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience. Just give me your question, then I'll repeat it so everybody can hear it and so people watching can hear it as well.
How are you? I do have a question about the herd immunity, because I believe in Sweden or something, 10% of people got infected or something and herd immunity started to occur. But then I've also heard that you're supposed to get some ridiculous, outrageous number like 70%. So what is needed in infection where people actually
Right.
contracting it?
So what's the threat? So this is an argument that has been playing out too, which is what's the actual percentage of people who need to be infected or vaccinated if a vaccine comes online in order to achieve herd immunity? And what do you say?
The short answer is we never know at the beginning of a pandemic what that threshold is, because the factor you don't know here is how many people are susceptible at the outset. So if we go back to January of this year or November, December of 2019, when the virus was first making its way around and nobody was talking about it, it's possible that a segment of the population, because of prior exposure to other coronaviruses, because coronavirus is not new, it's just this particular version, it's possible that 25% or so of the population is already and was then immune because of the antibodies they had from prior coronavirus infections. So that's a chunk of the population that's just not going to get it. You don't know what that number is at the beginning. So the proportion of people in the population that are immune gets larger and larger as people get infected. And of course, if a vaccine that works comes out, then that makes it larger again. What we do know is you need to have a substantial fraction, like 75%, who are immune, but we don't know how many people have to get infected to get to that level.
You know, I'm a clinical laboratory scientist, have been for years, and one thing that really bothers me is all these people saying, we need more tests, we need more tests, we need more tests, knowing in the scientific world that a test, just because you have a test doesn't mean it's a good test. You know, so a lot of people are veering away from the PCR because, you know, that is not as quick as they want to be. So a lot of people are out there just doing tests, you don't know their specificity or sensitivity, and people, that's all they want is more tests, and they don't realize that it doesn't make it a good test.
So the question is about testing and the diversity and quality of the different tests, quality versus quantity.
And there again, if you're testing we're testing about 1 million a day, and you have a 1% false positive rate, which is not unheard of. It can be higher than that. It could be 2 or 3% false positive. You're going to have 10,000, in 1 million tests, you're going to have 10,000 false positives, okay? So in a state like Washington, where they're saying you have to, or in California, Newsom has initiated this color coding. We start off at purple, you make your way to red, and then orange. There is no green. You make your way to amber, which is 50% open, and restaurants can have 50% capacity. There is no green because we should never return to normal. That's one of the criteria for getting to that top level, is to have a very low positive rate, like 1% or below 1%. Well, if the test if imperfections in the test preclude getting to that positive rate, then you're just stuck on yellow, never making it to green. So yeah, that's a huge factor. And why is it that why have we been sold on the idea that an answer to this is to test more and more people? If there's not an obvious thing that you do with the test results, then I would question the premise there. Was that money? Yeah. Somebody's getting a lot of money for all the tests.
It's good to know that we're on a ship that will never see a port. That's good.
We had data coming out from Italy in late March about the statistics on COVID-19 deaths. And the mean age at death there was 79.4 years with an average of 3 comorbidities. So these were unhealthy people near the end of their lives, near the life expectancy, who were dying with a positive COVID-19 test. So if you take that into account, we should have realized way back then, before we even started our lockdowns, this is not a disease that is slaying young, healthy people. This is, for the most part, one of many things that can be an end-of-life circumstance. It's not as though you're going to save a life by preventing a person who's 80 years old and has multiple comorbidities from getting COVID-19. They're going to die. We're all going to die. And that seems to be kind of a freaky thought that people have not got their heads around. So when you get those statistics together, it's not even as though this is wiping out populations that were healthy and it's only the COVID. In fact, it is killing people earlier, but it's probably killing people months, maybe a year before they would have died of something else, if you look at the statistics. We don't have our statistics guy here, though, do we?
Yeah, no, we don't. No, but I mean, this is an absolutely crucial point. This is why we think, for public health purposes, you want to talk about life years lost, because there is just a difference. But we all know that it's one thing if I die a month before I would have died, or 50 years before I would have died, right? And so that's the metric we actually want to focus on. And if we do that, the problem is we're using this completely bizarre thing of, well, we want a policy that even if we save one life, well, do you mean one net life, or what, we save one life and we kill 1,000 because of the policy? That's what the scenario actually is.
Well, this is an important point, because this happens so fast. The idea that we treat an 85-year-old at end of life the same way we treat a 12-year-old at the beginning of their life, we never do that for anything, which is why when a 12-year-old is gunned down in the streets of Chicago, that is a much greater tragedy than an 85-year-old who dies from a heart attack. We always treat that differently. We know this. It's just innate. And yet we're told exactly what you said now with respect to COVID and only COVID.
Well, this is what is keeping us in a panic, is that we're just basically not thinking clearly about the fact that we are mortal and we have a life expectancy. And if people are dying of something really close to the average life expectancy, that's data that we ought to factor into our emotional response. But honestly, our brains are not adapted to real-time, global panic porn hitting our retinas at the speed of light like it is now. And that's essentially what we're dealing with, is the first pandemic plus social media.
All right, I get the last question because I'm me. And this to me is a story, too, that has been under-discussed. We had Jeffrey Tucker from the American Institute for Economic Research on a number of times, and he told this story. And he's the only one that's written about it that I know of. The genesis of the idea that locking down healthy people is a good idea. And the genesis seems to be, I'm not kidding, the science project of a 14-year-old girl. Listen to this. I'm reading from Jeffrey Glass's piece this spring. Laura Glass, she was 14 at the time, with some guidance from her dad, who is a researcher. His name is Robert Glass, researcher, complex systems analyst, actually at Sandia National Laboratories. He had no medical training, no expertise in immunology or epidemiology. She, with some guidance from her dad, devised a computer simulation that showed how people, family members, coworkers, students in schools, people in social situations interact. What she discovered was that school kids come into contact with about 140 people a day, more than any other group. Based on her finding, her program showed that in a hypothetical town of 10,000 people, 5,000 people would be infected during a pandemic if no measures were taken, but only 500 would be infected if the schools were closed. This is a paper for her high school science project, 14-year-old, from about 15 years ago. Her dad picked up her science project, and he did a research paper on it. And then the research paper was picked up because of who Robert Glass was and the people that he interacted with, became this thing that was kicked around in the scientific community, including actual infectious disease experts. And all of a sudden, 15 years later, it's the policy of the Western world. It started out 15 years ago as a 14-year-old science project, and now we're all, not all, but many of us, hundreds of millions of people are living under this. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that story, but I'd just like to get your reaction.
Yeah, we write about it specifically, and it is true. And in fact, the New York Times even wrote glowingly about this science project, I think, in April. That's what's sort of extraordinary about it. What the key thing to notice, of course, a high schooler could discover something, but it was a computer simulation, right? It's not data. It's assume a certain kind of behavior, assume that it's being spread this way, and then kind of run the simulation. But this is how a model works. Models only tell you what you told them to tell you, right? And so unless the propositions, the assumptions of the model are anchored to reality, then they could tell you something, right? But if they're not, if they haven't been tested against reality, really all they are is a complicated, fancy argument that the government's probably paid for. And so honestly, one of the key lessons we need to learn is we need to separate predictive models that have not been tested against reality from public policy makers. There should just be a wall between them.
Or we need to get Laura Glass to do computer simulations on the trade-offs
Yes,
to
exactly.
lockdowns. Maybe
Yeah.
that could get picked
That
up
might
then
help,
too.
yeah.
But your reaction, especially as a scientist.
Well, I think it was a fantastic 14-year-old science fair project. Don't get me wrong. But we don't usually want to dictate world economic policy and national economic policy based on something like that. It's exactly right. And if Matt were here, he's got a whole chapter talking about modeling and the frailty of modeling. It is not data. When someone runs a model and says, according to my model, we should do this, they are not saying I went out and studied populations and here are my results. They assumed something. So you have to assume something to write the model. You write these assumptions into your model and then you hit go and it gives you a number at the end. So that's exactly what's happened here. Laura would have made assumptions like the 140 contacts at school. She would have made assumptions about the contacts people make if schools are closed, which likely are wrong because people are complicated. They're very hard to predict. And she hit go and it gave a result. But it's very, very questionable whether the result had any merit to it.
The book is The Price of Panic, How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. Pick up this book, and let's give Douglas Axe and Jay Richards a round of applause.
Thanks.
Thank you.